that is not someone that I've coached. It's the impact of me coaching someone and them coaching somebody else. And so sometimes we don't know where a conversation with one person will actually have the final outcome. And that's part of this holistic thinking, is that we don't really know. So therefore we can't be measuring our impact in a linear way of like, well, I set this goal and I've achieved this. It's like, well, maybe you could have done something much greater than that if you thought more holistically.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Illuminating Dialogues number 5 with Dr Jesvir Kaur Mahil. How are you, Dr Jesvir?
Very well, Harjot.
I'm very glad to hear. So Dr Jesvir Kaur is a creativity and leadership researcher, educator, writer, including the 6 of Stafford photo story, which illustrates 50 years in the lives of Sikhs coming from Punjab in the 60s to Stafford and settling in Stafford. And most recently, the Learn to Lead book that I've personally read, and I found it very inspiring, exploring the role of stories, symbols, and leadership styles. Also a senior leadership degree coach at the universities in England, and a lifelong leadership education consultancy called University of Life. So it's a really pleasure and honor to talk to you on Illuminating Dialogues. So before we get into talking about today's topic, how to learn and coach holistically, if people haven't come across your work, maybe you can give a short introduction about yourself.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on your program, Harjot. It's a pleasure being here with you and conversing with yourself. Your introduction has been quite thorough, really. So what else could I say apart from that is that I'm very passionate about learning in addition to being an educator. And I think that's one of the key things. It's like once we stop learning ourselves, in a way, I think there's that saying, like, once we stop learning, we start dying. So there is this kind of the need to be constantly learning. The journey never ends. It's a never-ending journey. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today about holistic learning and holistic coaching.
Absolutely. And those of you watching as well, just before this, we talked about having an organic conversation. We talked about having a creative conversation. And in many ways, learning also has that structure. So we often think of, especially during when we're younger, that learning has to be some sort of rigid exercise. But in my opinion, learning is actually more creative in nature. And hopefully this conversation will be organic and reflect that as well. So just to get started, obviously the topic is how to learn and coach holistically. Now, there's a lot of topics there. People might not know what coaching is, especially some people from the South Asian diaspora might not have come into contact with coaching before. Holistic is also quite a big word, and learning is also quite a big word as well. So I was just wondering if we could maybe provide a context for people who are not really used to this topic. From your perspective, how would you define, what is learning, what is coaching, what does it mean to be holistic?
I suppose when you read my book, Learn to Lead, the first chapter talks about all the different ways that we're learning. We learn from the day that we're born. The first thing we learn is how to breathe. We learn to drink, to feed, and to smile, to get attention, for example, or to cry to get attention, basically. So we're learning all the time. It's this constant kind of journey of very often we associate learning with the classroom, and nowadays it's like we know that learning doesn't only take place in the classroom. Learning takes place very often in an informal setting. You and I having a conversation, hopefully there will be learning taking place through our conversation. And when you talk about coaching, well, coaching is just one way that we learn through conversations. And I think nowadays they're calling it conversation therapy as well. In the past, it used to be like psychoanalysis, like, following Freud and whatever. But now there's this whole kind of approach to conversation therapy where we ask questions, we create a safe space where there's trust for the person to be able to reflect. And so, in a way, coaching can be acting like a mirror for somebody, like um, something that we can use to reflect and to listen to our own thoughts sometimes. As I'm speaking to you,
Mm.
I'm kind of like becoming kind of aware, well, where am I going with this? And so you're acting as an anchor for me to be able to reflect on my own kind of intentions, my own aspirations. All sorts of motivations can arise and become clearer because we're having a conversation about it.
Right. And it's such an intuitive model, as you said. We are in the present, and that anchor, we are detecting or we're seeing that person in the present. So that sort of their body language, but even deeper than that, their presence almost. We can we can view ourselves in a much deeper level, because I'm almost feeling a sort of pressure almost to express myself, and then I'm able to almost view or in real time analyze that pressure, and makes me reflect upon myself a lot more than than a more structured way. So it's definitely, it gets your intuition more involved in a way that a sort of structured way wouldn't necessarily.
Yeah, and taking the conversation to that whole concept of it being holistic,
Mm.
I think one of the starting points for that is the paradigm through which we are seeing that coaching relationship or the teacher student relationship. There's two ways, well, at least two ways to look at it. One way is I look at, if I'm in the teacher role and you're in the student role, or
Mm.
you're in the coach role and I'm the coachee, one way to look at that relationship is that we're two separate entities.
Right.
You're the coach and I'm the coachee. So that's looking at you in isolation from myself. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that we're having a conversation in which the conversation unites us. And so when you talk about presence,
Mm.
presence is kind of, um, you and I both know in Sikhi,
Mm.
we have that concept of oneness,
Yes.
ekongar, the oneness, and that there is no separation. We're connected. We're part of the same story. So therefore, you and I engaged in this conversation, there is that oneness, that wholeness, as opposed to I'm the teacher, you're the student, and there's that separation. So depending on the paradigm that we're using, the quality of that conversation may be different, because we're from that teacher student role, I might feel that I'm in a superior position to my student, and so that the
Mm.
information comes out in a hierarchical way. Whereas if I think of you as the coach and I'm the coachee, but we're on an equal platform, then there's that horizontal kind of relationship. The conversation has a different quality. And so I know, like in Sikhi, we're very kind of we sit on the floor. One of the
Mm.
reasons we sit on the floor is so that no one is in a higher position, no one's sitting on a higher chair because they have a higher status. We sit on the floor, and so that floor, that ground, equalizes us, doesn't it?
Right. And like you mentioned there, it seems to touch on some qualities of receptivity. And not only, because you mentioned hierarchy, not only the student, but also the teacher, and that the teacher is also receptive to what he or she are saying, but also how the student is reacting, or even if you can call it a student, right? So, this degree of receptivity and almost sensitivity, you're right, in this paradigm, it almost changes your view of who you're turning up as in a conversation, or who you're being in a conversation.
Yes, because it's the thing about the feedback. So, in a traditional teacher student role, which is hierarchical, the teacher is usually the one who is disseminating the knowledge,
Right.
but the students are simply expected to receive it
Mm.
without. Whereas in the modern kind of teaching environment, the students will give feedback, the
Mm.
students will ask questions, the students will respond and argue with the teacher rather than simply accepting everything they're saying. And so there's those feedback loops. And again, like when we're on an equal platform, there's more scope for there to be for you and I both to be receptive to the feedback.
Right. And dialogues, right? The reason this is called Illuminating Dialogues is it's sort of like a ping pong table. If you know optical fiber, optical fibers bounce light. I'm an engineer, so this metaphor sticks in my head. And so that light will hit against the side of an optical fiber and end up at its source. But in terms of a conversation, we're having a dialogue. So let's say there's no goal, but there is a destination, let's say, that we're going to reach. And we're sort of ping ponging off each other. And the space in between, we can call it as a oneness. Of course, we're also part of that oneness. But then within that flow, we are essentially having that dialogue or that flow of meaning.
I'm so glad that you brought up the fact that you're an engineer.
Yes.
That is, yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because as an engineer, you know, you you had to specialize, you had to focus, you had to be very analytical. And when you talk about fiber optics, it's like, if you, I understand fiber optics, but if you go into more detail than that, you would lose me. And I, on the other hand, I'm not an engineer. I teach leadership, I teach managers. And so it's not specialist knowledge. It's more kind of the blue sky thinking. It's more, like generalized knowledge. It's not detailed and specific. So that this is another kind of difference between, like, there's a space for both. Obviously, the reason I'm really glad that you brought up the fact that you're an engineer is to demonstrate that holistic teaching or holistic learning or holistic coaching is not as though it's better. It's a better approach than the more kind of specialized one. There's room for both, but in some cases you need to be specialist, you need to isolate, you need to analyze, and in other situations we need to have the blue sky thinking. We need to think more generally, think more, think about like breadth rather than depth.
Right. And it's so nice that you've almost said one is not better than the other, right? But they're integrating, and there is different forms of human thinking, and obviously the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, right? So the way we think as a human being also reflects the way nature is and the way nature interacts. So it's very important to integrate all styles of thinking. So now that we've covered some kind of abstract understanding of what does it mean in coaching and in terms of being holistic, really in a practical way, how does that benefit the person? We did talk about talking therapy, but being a person, being a normal person, how does this aid me in learning, or how does this aid me in developing as a human being?
Well, for example, if we watch the news every day, to be informed. And I suppose that if we are aware of our own preferred style of thinking, which for me, it's that holistic, that's my preferred style, the blue sky thinking. And for someone else, it might be more focused, more specialized. As long as we're aware of what our style is, then we have to remind ourselves that that's not the only way to think about the situation. So, for example, now in the news, we every day we hear about the Gaza and Israel, for example. And when we hear the news about that, when we watch the news, we can see how people are thinking, which type of thinking that they're using when they present. So, for example, there are some people who say, oh, this started on the 7th of October. Well, that's one way of thinking. That's the linear kind of thinking where you isolate and that's when it started and that's when it ended. And there's the other way of thinking where we think, well, no, it didn't start on the 7th of October. It started in 1948. Or we can say, no, actually, it started even before 1948. It started at the end of the Ottoman Empire. And then someone can say, well, no, actually, it started even before that. So you see, we can go, one way of thinking is like the context is really important, and we can go broader and broader. It's like, did it start with Moses? Well, actually, maybe it started even before Moses,
Right.
so we can go very broad.
Mm.
And on the other hand, we can say, no, that was that event, that was the start, and this is a consequence of that event. Whereas with the holistic thinking, we don't think in linear cause and effect terms.
Mm.
We think about the ripple effect. You see, the ripple effect. You throw a little pebble in the pond, and when you throw the pebble in the pond, it all those ripples have unforeseen consequences, and it's very complex, isn't it?
Mm. Very nicely put.
Mm.
And getting to that line of thinking, I say line, it's not exactly a line, but getting to that area of thinking, as you explain it, it sounds very great. But for people who haven't entered that holistic thinking or don't use it in their day to day lives, it may sound to them very good and very useful. But in terms of them accessing this area, maybe they don't even realize they're accessing this area. But how can a person notice that they're inside this thinking pattern, or how can they access it more readily?
Well, let's kind of think of another example then, which would be relevant to all of us. Let's say we cut our finger. You cut your finger. You know exactly like what happened to cause that cut,
Mhm.
and you know what to do about it. You go and get a plaster, and it's going to heal. So it's like, or maybe you cut it very deeply, and you need a few stitches, and so that's the cause and effect thing. Or let's say you've been diagnosed with diabetes. Diabetes is very different to a cut in the finger, isn't it? So a
Absolutely.
cut in the finger, it's like cause and effect. Or you fall down and you bruise yourself, and so again, like, what caused that bruise. Whereas something like diabetes, something like cancer, something like dementia, all of these chronic illnesses, they you don't know what the cause is. We don't know, do we? We don't know what causes diabetes,
Mm.
and therefore the response to it, either we take that drug, we take metformin, or we take the relevant kind of pill, but that's not going to cure it. So
Right.
whether you need to think in the linear kind of the specialist type of thinking, if it's a simple problem. If
Mm.
it's a simple problem like a cut or a bruise or something like that, that's a simple thing. It's you can identify quite easily what caused it and what the solution is. Or it could be even complex. You've broken your arm, you can't mend it yourself. It's
Mm.
complex. You've got to go to the hospital and get it plastered and whatever, but there's a solution for it. But something like diabetes or other chronic illnesses, you don't know what the solution is. One solution could be to go to the doctor, but that's not the only solution there is, because they don't have the cure for it. No one has the cure. They can only kind of like manage the symptoms. But
Mm.
for that, you need to use that holistic thinking, and we need to look at our lives without separating, because with that fragmented style of thinking, we could separate ourselves into mind, body, and spirit, and
Yes.
as though the body is separate from the mind, is separate from the spirit. But with holistic thinking, that the mind, body, and spirit are all one. Again, going back to Sikhi, oneness,
Mm.
Ikungar, like it's all interconnected, and we can't cure the body without thinking about what the mind needs to do in order to cure the body, and the spirit needs to do. Everything is interconnected, and so we need to think holistically, and we have to think about our lifestyle, not only our lifestyle, but the environment that we're living in, the relationships that we have. So it's a whole complex set of factors that we have to figure out.
Mm. And you mentioned medicine there, right? And that reductionist thinking on the
Mhm.
Western front. Of course, not completely, but we do see it's good leaning to this front. And then we also see topics like Ayurveda from the Indian side, and that encompasses a more holistic. Now, these can actually work in tandem very nicely together, One is more of a lifestyle based medicine, and one is a more endpoint treatment. Let's say if you're having like a almost like a death experience or emergency accident, then Western medicine, you'd pick this, of course. If you want to maintain long health, then Ayurveda would be good. And like you said, the complexity of the issue. So when we
And
are, yeah, when we,
sorry, again, it's like one is not better than the other.
yes,
Not as though Ayurveda is better than,
yes,
the Western medicine. We need to complete. We need to find a way of like saying, well, when do we need this and when
mhm,
do we need that? But this and that are both important.
yes, and then going into um the understanding of why we are thinking like this sort of binary system versus this more, let's say, the color wheel system or creative system. Well, I don't know if you're familiar with um, Dr. Ian McGilchrist's work, University
No.
of Oxford, but he talks very nicely about left and right hemisphere thinking. So if a patient will have a stroke on one hemisphere of the brain, what they'll find is, depending on what hemisphere it is, this will be adopting a more black and white view of the world, versus in another hemisphere of the brain, they'll have a much more integrated, and the world will seem much more vivid, right? And so they are genuinely both views of the world that we can tap into. And
Mm.
of course, we all have different personalities, or as Indian philosophy would say, we all have different prakrutis. And so, of course, we're all going to view the world through different lenses. We have poets in the world, but also we have engineers in the world. So, so it's a matter of, if first understanding where we are naturally resting, I think, and if we're in a conversation, maybe where the other person is naturally resting, and maybe we can have a talk about that 7 dimensional model, and then noticing how we can expand that reference point.
Mm. No, I'm not familiar with that doctor's work,
Mhm,
but when you talk about black and white, um, and again, when you talk about right and left hemispheres,
mhm,
for a while we went through this kind of, there was this stage where people were saying, oh, the left brain is responsible for this and the right brain is kind of more artistic, the
mhm,
left brain is more logical, and it was as though people thought one was better than the other again, like
absolutely.
the artists would be proud of their right hemisphere brain and the mathematicians would be proud of the left side of the brain. But when we hear about the work of Leonardo da Vinci, for example, and um, outstanding creatives like that, we know that they were both absolutely geniuses in both mathematics and art.
Mhm,
They use both sides of their brain. So again, it's not as though one side of the brain is better than the other. We need to be using both of both sides, and that's what makes us most effective, is when we're using both the left and the right. And this goes back to again the holistic learning, because I was talking to a teacher, a headmaster actually, and he was saying how he's advocating his infants. That he's headmaster for an infant school, that they must learn music,
mhm,
because if they don't learn music later on in life, that disadvantage of not having access to music will hold them back. And he works in a deprived area in London, and so for that reason he was, because if he wasn't working in a deprived area, like you can assume that the parents will take care of those kind of needs of the children to engage in art and music and all of these hobbies, whereas in a deprived area, the parents may not have the means, they don't have the time or the finances to be able to fund music for their children. And he's championing that. Why? Because again, having um, responding to our learning in a holistic way, where we're using both sides of the brain rather than just focusing on the STEM subjects, as it were.
right. And I like how you beautifully took that abstract concept into something more practical, right? And so, for people watching who are maybe more on the corporate side, I can also say a very similar analogy in a corporate world. So, For example, if we're in the corporate world, I work for an American company, and we're always having conversations around balancing productivity and sustainability. And productivity means that we're wanting to hit certain KPIs. Again, we're using that very, let's say, linear thinking. But then that's very tangible. But how do we account for the intangible aspects? How do we account for the space in between, let's say? And so what does that look like? Well, leaders have to take into account time that colleagues spend talking to one another, the rest colleagues take that allows them to think in a different way to solve problems. And that's all going to be intangible qualities that factor into the tangible KPI, which will work towards the company's mission and their goal, right? So this actually has a very practical benefit, which is very important, obviously in the corporate world with kids. And for me, this harkens back, or this resonates back to a very core principle, not just in human beings, but in the very nature again, Ego of the universe itself, which is miri piri. Because piri, we have the quality of beer, the wise person, this openness, this holisticness, this timelessness dimension. And then miri, coming from the word amir, king or princely um, power. It's really worldly power, a very temporal power, a very transient power, but nonetheless one that has to funnel the timeless quality to almost manifest that result. So I think that's quite an important concept that's very hard to just talk about. But when we're practicing it, when we're noticing athletes practice this or musicians practice this, that versus people who don't practice this balance, we can sort of tell that difference between sustainable productivity versus just productivity alone.
Yeah, I think, yeah, again, thank you for bringing in Miri Piri, because that's about holistic thinking as well, isn't it? And in my mind, when I think of those two, I just think about matter versus nature. And matter is important. Matter is the product. Matter is, the productivity, as you talk about, the tangible things. That's all the matter. The mind creates the matter. Whereas the space in between, the processes, we can't create those products if the processes are flawed.
Mm.
So there needs to be the space to think about the systems that, and the intangible processes, the well-being of the staff. I was just talking to one of my students today, and we were talking about the importance of well-being, because if we don't take the well-being of our staff into consideration, it's not sustainable. They will move on to another organization where they will be valued more, they will be respected more, because it's not always about finance, especially with the younger generation Z. They look for work where their values are in alignment rather than a job for life. So again, it's that in the past, like going back 30 years ago, a lot of people would be in careers, they would be counseled to aim for jobs for life, and permanence and whatever. Whereas this holistic thinking, it's not about permanence, it's change is constant. So we're continuously alert to changes rather than trying to maintain the status quo and to have jobs for life. I mean, nowadays, what do you, because I know you're a lot younger than myself, what do you think about that concept of a job for life? Is that something that interests you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you'll know, if you've watched my YouTube channel, I am training as a coach, right? So, this is obviously why we're having this conversation as well. So, as I progress in my coaching career, as I've coached people offline, I see that, wow, I'm now developing these coaching qualities in my work. I'm doing people leadership development. But then I see myself developing, maybe some courses, maybe some training, doing podcasts such as this. So when we look at nature and okay, maybe a tree is a tree for life, but the tree is still going to grow and it's still going to have different branches and it's going to have different seasons, it's going to have different leaves. So often we forget that we are nature and we sort of separate the human from nature, but we are nature.
Yes. And again, that reminds me of something that you probably read in the book when I talk about the four seasons.
Yes.
And as you were talking, I was thinking about the seed versus the fruit.
Yes.
You know, the seed, like when you're talking about productivity, the product is like the seed, but there's the fruit as well. Like we can't be continuously striving and, working hard. We need to take time out to enjoy, because in the olden days, today's Thanksgiving, isn't it? In America,
In
it's
America.
Thanksgiving. And here in England, when I was a child, we used to have harvest festivals at school.
Mm.
There needs to be, it's cyclical. There needs to be kind of, we can't be on a linear treadmill the whole time. It needs to be, we need to have spaces again where we can grow, we can regenerate, and we can just simply enjoy.
And there's almost some mystical quality as well, right? Because who is the one that determines who I want to be? So 5 years ago, if I said I want to be like this, but I'm not exactly there right now. So can I predict exactly 5 years later? So we have to allow, again, in our own lives, for that intangible quality, we have to allow ourselves to be shaped by the environment, but also co-create with that environment. And so on that note, carrying that golden thread, I was just wondering if we could touch on that, 7-dimensional model, because I think it'd be really helpful.
7D thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah. The 7D thinking, that's a model that I've created like for coaching,
Mhm.
for where rather than the traditional kind of the outcomes based approach where we set a goal and then we kind of like set milestones to achieve that goal, it can be very linear. For me, it's more about thinking with the 7D model. I look at 7 different perspectives, above, as in sociologically, environmentally, ecologically, where are we positioned, to where is the starting point? And because obviously if I'm um, if I'm positioned in West Midlands,
Mhm.
my outcomes or whatever intentions that I might have, they it's I suppose the best way for me to describe that positioning is like if you try to plant a mango tree in the middle of a desert,
Okay.
you know.
That's a good example.
Use that metaphor. Yeah, that metaphor. It's like, well, okay, you might need to think twice.
Yeah.
If you are a mango seed, you might need to think of a different positioning for yourself. So the position above is important. And then below, it's the unconscious drivers that motivate us, and that will be different again because you and I both come from the Sikhi background, so this won't be a surprise to you. But very often in the Western frame of mind, we have a beginning. We were born and we will die, and that's kind of like a linear birth death. Whereas we think more cyclically. It's like, well, we didn't just exist when we were born. We existed before that, and so there's that. There's unconscious drivers. There's unresolved things that we brought into this life with us that we have to resolve, and that can be, those can be the motivating drivers which we're not conscious of. And so we need to kind of find ways, like metaphorically or symbolically, to access the unconscious. And then there's the behind, the history, what's brought us here, what's our story, the aspirations going forward, and then the values. Like I look at the material values on one hand, and on the other hand, there's the social values. But most importantly is what the word that you talked about right at the beginning of this conversation is the presence, and that presence comes from our inside. What's inside all of this. And so that's that kind of looking at the coaching from those different perspectives, the most important one being the presence, because the presence is the essence of everything that we are, past, present, and future. It encompasses our aspirations and our history and our position, the mind, body, and spirit. It's that union, it's that oneness of everything. So in a way, I suppose the best way to describe it is like as a hologram rather than a straight line.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that. And as a new coach as well, that's very useful to hear, right? Because going into a coaching session, we have at the back of our subconscious, right? We need to get the client, some goals here. We need to get them 3 points by the end of the session, and maybe the client's also in that mindset of, I need to get something out of this session. So how have you found working with this more 7D model on a, let's say, slightly less outcome centric approach? How have you found that for both yourself and whoever you're working with, or the group of people you're working with?
I think it can be very um, empowering
Mm.
because the way I use this model, it's the person that I'm coaching, they're senior leaders, so they're not like students
Mm.
who, like when I'm in a teacher student model and I'm coaching my students, I'm in a position of power, but with my senior leaders, I'm not in a position of power. We're equals, and they are using the framework to coach their own staff as well. You see, and so it's it's that ripple effect. So it's not a linear relationship; it's that oneness. And so what I'm seeing is that kind of expansion of the the impact
Mm.
or the influence in a holistic way rather than in a linear way. And so the results would be, well, somebody's been promoted. The results would be, well, somebody's kind of decided that they're not they're a better fit in a different department compared with this. And so that is not someone that I've coached. It's the impact of me coaching someone and them coaching somebody else. And so you see, it's sometimes we don't know where a conversation with one person
Mm.
will actually have the final outcome, and that's part of this holistic thinking, is that we don't really know, so that therefore we can't be measuring our impact in a linear way of like, well, I set this goal and I've achieved this. It's like, well, maybe you could have done something much greater than that if you thought more holistically.
Right. And I think that you mentioned a key word there, measurable, right? So, measurable, how do we weigh ourselves? How are we worth? How much are we worth? So, if we're looking at ourselves on an individual level or family level, collective level, a company level, what value is your program bringing to the company, right? What is the measure of your worth as a coach? How are you going to demonstrate that? How does that affect our KPIs? Well, if we're using a very linear approach to measure things, okay, it's very, very easy to show, right? And but as we're seeing here, there is also let's say, a less linear outcome that occurs. How can we show that? Well, then we have to change our very aspect of how we're measuring things, of how we're showing worth, and this also is another self challenge. Let's say.
Yes, and you see, one thing I have to say that's really important here is that, again, here there's the Eurocentric approach, the Western approach of like categorizing everything, categorizing and measuring intangible tangible outcomes.
Yes.
That's, and we have to see the limitations of that approach, because that approach of categorization, of course it's valid, it's valuable in some cases, in many cases, but not all the time. And like when during the period of colonization in India, for example, it was the British that categorized people into, these are the Muslims and these are the Hindus and these are the Sikhs. And it's like, we didn't categorize ourselves like that before.
Mm-hmm.
And we were pigeonholed
Mm-hmm.
into these categories. And then when in 1947, they brought in Radcliffe, who was a map maker, a specialist, a narrow, with a narrow focus on,
Mm-hmm.
he was obviously an expert map maker, and he drew a line in the middle of the Punjab, categorizing simply on like, well, these are the Muslims and these are the Hindus. It's like majority Muslims here and majority, and it's like that caused the death of about 2 million people. You
Yes.
see that partition, that thinking, that specialist narrow focus thinking, that caused a devastation. And so the reason I bring that up, that we don't always have to be categorical. We don't have to put people into pigeonholes and categorize them like, this is an introvert, that's an extrovert. And it's like, well, no, people are much more complex than that. And outcomes are not always tangible and measurable. We don't have to quality. What is quality? Quality is a concept. Can you see quality? Well, not always. We can't always see quality, can we? But we know when it's there. Beauty, we know when it's there, but we might not be able to articulate what makes this person more beautiful than the other person. We can't articulate it, but we can sense it, right? But we can't, it's not necessarily in a tangible way. And so the answer to your question there is that we don't always have to be looking for categories. We don't always have to be looking for tangible outcomes, and we need to kind of broaden out and think, well, it's not always about measuring outcomes. We can be mapping things. We can be thinking about relationships rather than tangible outcomes.
Right. And it's also moving in that sliding scale, right, between tangible and that intangible aspect. So for some people, it might be helpful as a starting point to be like, oh, I'm more introverted here. Therefore, I might need to reserve my energy. But then as they understand themselves a bit more, they'll notice that they also have extroverted tendencies and
Yeah,
open up. So
that's right. I mean,
yeah,
people put me in the pigeonhole of being an introvert, but I'm not always an introvert.
yes,
Sometimes I'm an extrovert,
yes.
and so it depends on the context again. So it goes back to that, like, it's not, it can be helpful to think, well, people are different. People do think differently. Some people enjoy going to parties and other people prefer reading books, and, they get their energy in different ways, whatever. But to pigeonhole people, to categorize them as black and white, rich and poor, all of that, it's like, let's see people as being unique, complex, individuals. And again, like, seeing people as individuals, we have to look at people in their context as well. Like, what makes me who I am. I think you live in Scotland and I live in England, and so even though we have a lot of similarities, we're different because I've hardly ever been to Scotland. I've only been to Scotland a few times, so I don't know what your reality is, and so I can't make assumptions.
Right, exactly. And yeah, I think that's just a brilliant way to, as we wrap up, maybe with that 7D modes of thinking, and then talking about holistically learning and coaching. I think we covered a whole lot in this conversation that maybe for people who haven't come across this before, it might be a lot, but people who have maybe been following this sort of content, hopefully that's opened up and caused you to also think in some different ways. So, is there any other maybe loose strands that came up to you that you might want to maybe just caveat with as we begin to slowly wrap up?
I suppose, it's very difficult to kind of analyze our approaches in a short period of time, because I kind of rushed to explain the 7 different angles and whatever. So that obviously is just kind of a very summarized view of it. But I suppose the important thing once again is, let's kind of not think that one approach is better than the other approach, and that we need different approaches depending on the situation, depending on the problems that we're trying to solve. And overall, if it's a complex thing that we're trying to explore, for something which is complex, we need holistic thinking.
Right.
For something which is complicated, as in like repairing a watch, or something is broken and it's complicated, but we know, we can look on YouTube and find out how to repair that, then we need a more kind of specialized, more focused approach. Because why do we go to YouTube? We go to YouTube because there's somebody there who is more of an expert than we are, who's kind of delved into it more deeply. But whereas for something which is more complex, we might need more than one version of the truth, as it were.
And more than one version of the truth. What a way to maybe end our conversation with, because that's something to make the mind stir. So I like to end my conversations just with a question. that I use in my own coaching, which is go slow to go far. So, for people watching this, what is one piece of advice for people to use in their own life to go slow, to go far in their own life?
Yeah, I think meditation
Mm,
is, like that goes back to the three principles of Sikhi, namjapal,
mm,
namjapal. And the more we kind of go back to the source of who we are, the less we need to do. So maybe like the focus on our being, if we focus on being rather than doing, so that meditative um, starting point
mm,
can take us more into our being rather than our doing. So it's working smarter rather than harder, I suppose.
Beautiful. And hopefully that doing will carrying that being energy. So for those of the listeners who've not come across you before, how could they connect with you? How could they learn more and find out about you online?
I have a website called justfeed.com,
Okay,
and I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. So just Googling Justfeed as in Jesvir, people should be able to find me.
wonderful. And are you happy for me to put that down in the description box below?
Yes. And I hope this won't be the last of our conversations. I hope, conversations are meant to be continued. And so hopefully we will talk again at some point, maybe in the new year.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk to you again. Thank you again so much. It's such an honor. And I wish you a good
Likewise.
rest of the
Like,
evening.
yeah. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.